I was locked in a customized coffin. This was a desperate measure for desperate times. I used to work for a secret organization called the Department for Strange Affairs, which was based in an underground chamber below central London. Night after night, I faced danger hunting down monsters which plagued the city. The ordinary people who worried about work and relationships, and paying the bills and the extra pounds that they'd put on that month, they had no idea about this battle to keep the world safe. But I had lived and breathed it. Returning zombies to their graves, capturing destructive ghosts, and putting slimy river beasts out of action had all been a part of the job. I also had a run-in with werewolves, only I had been careless. One of them had bitten me, and I was left carrying the curse of lycanthropy in my veins. I had been placed on indefinite leave from the department as a result of this, and I was feeling pretty low. Being a monster hunter had meant everything to me. But that was the situation that I was in, and I needed to deal with it. My initial priority was preparing to face my first full moon since I had been bitten. When I was working at the Department for Strange Affairs, I was always on the night shift, so the days were meant for sleep. The problem was, this being London, there was a constant noise outside, from sirens and car stereos and roadwork, and people shouting in the street. And there was also the hammering and drilling bleeding through from my neighbor's property. They were renovation freaks. The solution to my problem was inspired by an encounter with a vampire that slept in a coffin. The next day, I bought a top-of-the-range casket for myself, and I had it lined with silk, added air conditioning and vents, soundproofed it, and I slept like a baby. But now my situation had changed. I had customized the coffin for a second time, replacing silk with steel, and adding a locking mechanism on a timer. I wanted to ensure that I could not get out during the full moon, while I was transformed into a werewolf. And now the time had come to see if the coffin would hold. The full moon had risen. Locked in the customized coffin, I could not see the moon, but I could sure feel it. It was pulling me, harder and harder until it felt like it was tearing me apart and exposing the darkness inside. I started to convulse. I was struggling to swallow, to breathe. I could feel bones breaking and muscles twisting. I could feel sharp pain all over my skin. I screamed, only it was not a man's voice that emerged. It was a howl, the cry of a beast. I lashed out, felt claws strike the steel lining. They scratched deep, but they could not cut through. I howled again. I was in so much pain. Not from the change, because I was the beast now. I was the darkness. I howled with hunger, with the desire that raced through me. I needed meat rich with blood. I needed a heart that still pulsed to crush between my teeth and gorge myself on. But I was trapped and tortured, and alone for hour after hour, until the full moon had faded. It was dawn and my ordeal was over. At 8 a.m., the timer released the lock. I felt very weak by this stage, and I wasn't sure if I even had the strength to lift the lid. But I managed it, and I dragged myself out, stumbled into the bathroom, and then stood there in the morning light, breathing deeply. I half expected to see dark, matted fur covering my body when I looked in the mirror, but I was ordinary, a man that no one had noticed on the busy streets of London. I looked tired and pale, and I stank of sweat. Boy, did I ever. I spent a long time in the shower, alternating between as cold as I could stand and as hot as I could stand. When I finally emerged, a wave of dizziness overwhelmed me, and I almost fainted. But this passed, and I knew that I was going to be okay. I had made it. But still, I shivered as I recalled the hideous events of the night and decided that I needed some fresh air. I put on a tracksuit and my trainers, I lined up some tunes on my phone, and I left the apartment. I did some stretching exercises, and then I started off jogging, following the course of the river. I tried not to, but I kept thinking about the department. I missed my job so much. I sighed and stopped running. I looked down into the water. Even on a late summer's day, the river was dark and cold. Litter drifted by, carried on the tide. I felt lost and upset, and one question kept replaying in my mind. What next? I had no idea, but I did know that standing around feeling sorry for myself would solve nothing. I took a deep breath, clenched my hands into fists, and turned the music up and began to once more run. I increased my speed steadily, zoning out the people around me, and started to feel both calmer and more energized. I ran for hours, not caring where I was heading, and it felt good. I finally came to a halt on a street that I did not recognize. There was a coffee shop on the other side of the road, an independent one rather than a branch of a faceless chain. I was thirsty, and for the first time that day I had an appetite. I was just crossing over the street when I noticed the van pulling up ahead of me. My old job had trained me to be hyper-observant of anything unusual, and the van had set off an internal alarm. It was very bland-looking with regular plates and looked in need of a wash. There were two men in front, both casually dressed, both checking their phones. Most people would have not given them a second look, but I could not take my eyes off them, because everything about them and the vehicle that they were in told me that they worked for the Department for Strange Affairs. Were they there because of me? I wondered. Were they following me? The department had a dedicated monitoring team with access to CCTV cameras throughout the city, and many other ways of tracking people and uncovering information. They would have been able to follow the route of my run with ease. But why? Why would the department want to keep tabs on me? I could only think of one answer, and it made me feel sick to my core. They were following me because I was a monster now, because they thought that I was a threat. Feeling cut adrift was bad enough, but this was a nightmare. My appetite lost and the nausea now cramping my guts, I started to run again. There was no point me confronting the two men in the van. They would only be following orders. What I needed to do was speak to the man who had been my supervisor at the department. He had been my boss for years and had always had my back. He was an ex-soldier and always immaculately dressed in a tailored suit. He also had an old-fashioned prosthetic leg, which he refused to have upgraded. I had a lot of respect for the man, so I would speak to him in private. I would be honest, reassure him that I had measures in place to prevent my lycanthropy being a danger to anyone. I would trust him. I once more increased my pace, and weirdly I started to feel better. In a very perverse way, the situation was helpful. Before, all I had was empty hours to fill. Now I had a purpose. I had a mission. My supervisor lived south of the river. I did not know his address, but I knew his way to work. If I could intercept him and persuade him to give me 5 minutes of his time, I believed that I could succeed, and the dogs in the van would be called off. I had reached the entrance to an underground station. London's vast network of tube stations and lines was world famous, but there were parts of the system which very few people knew about. Before descending the steps, I looked up an old map online on my phone. This could work, I thought, and then I hurried down towards the platform. I was surrounded by commuters, all connected to their phones and disconnected from each other. Pretending to be absorbed by the screen of my phone, I blended into the crowd. About halfway down the steps there was a door marked out of use. Quick as a flash, I picked its lock, darted through and slammed it closed. Darkness enveloped me. The sounds of footsteps clattering by filled the space, and then a train hurtled past somewhere close but out of sight. Using the torch on my phone to show the way, I moved into the darkness. From the map that I had called up earlier, I knew this passage led to a platform that had been closed down 50 years ago. There were a number of these across the network, all abandoned because they were outdated or underused. I walked out onto the old platform. Faded posters still lined the walls and decades of dust coated the floor. It was an easy drop down to the line. This was no longer in use either, and I was perfectly safe as I walked along the tracks. Safe from trains and electric shocks, and from being tracked by the Department for Strange Affairs. No one had eyes or ears down here, and I could get closer to my destination using this method. For the first time that day, I smiled. I had left the old platform behind and was now moving through a tunnel. It stretched ahead of me for over a mile according to the map. I ran the light from my phone over the tracks just in front of me to check that there were no debris that I might trip over. And then I raised the beam and looked out into the tunnel and inhaled sharply. A dozen feet ahead of me, a spider's web filled the tunnel. It must have been made by a single giant arachnid or a multitude of smaller spiders. The web was vast. It was stunning in its scale and complexity. But my eyes were drawn to its center, where a body hung suspended in the web. It was an adult, a man I saw, as I played the beam of the torch along its form. He was not moving. Questions burnt inside me. How had he come to be here? Was he like me, a fugitive, seeking a hiding place? Or was he simply looking for somewhere warm and dry? Whatever had driven him here, his fate had been truly hideous, caught in this monstrous web. Taking deep breaths to try and calm myself, I moved towards him. He was silent and still, and I feared the worst. It was not till I was within touching distance and could see him clearly that I understood just how bad it was. It was a corpse held in the web, the remains of a man who had been consumed from the inside. The spider or spiders who built this web and trapped this human prey must have laid eggs inside of him, and the spiderlings had fed on his flesh, until this was all that was left of him, a husk, the shell of a once living and breathing person. I was repulsed and in serious trouble because, without meaning to, I had touched the web, sent vibrations out along its length, and alerted its makers. Not one huge spider, but hundreds of them, each the size of my hand and all emerging from cracks in the tunnel and scurrying towards me along the web. In moments, I would be in the embrace of their legs and become a new nursery for their young, a new source of nutrients. I span round, meaning to run back the way that I had come, but more spiders had appeared. The floor of the tunnel was alive with them, and they were scurrying towards me. I turned again. Even if I threw myself at the web with all my strength, I would not break through it. I would be trapped, held while these spiders crawled up my legs and into my clothes, onto my face and my hair. There was, though, another way. I couldn't hesitate, not if I wanted to escape. I ran at the emptied-out corpse. It was the one weak point in the barrier between me and survival. And the husk did break, leaving me free to run, leaving the web and the spiders in my wake. I was running blind and saw a door ahead of me. I did not bother picking its lock. Instead, I attacked it with the heel of my boot. Its wooden frame splintered and I was through. I was standing in a bright place. A tube train was pulling away and I was surrounded by people. They were looking at me with shock and disgust in their faces and backing away. I looked down at myself. Strands of web that I had picked up in my escape clung to my arms and legs. I cursed. So much for staying off the radar. I was broadcasting my position to the Department of Strange Affairs, and now they would just not want to track me. They would want to bring me in. I ran for the barriers, vaulted them, and scrambled up the steps and out onto the street. I glanced around, looking desperately for the best route away from there. There was an underpass to my left, and it was covered in graffiti, and the ground around its entrance was thick with litter. On the plus side, any CCTV cameras in it would no doubt have been trashed by vandals. The last thing I wanted to do was head back under the ground after my recent encounter, but I could see no other choice. I dashed towards the underpass. A cocktail of nauseating smells hit me as I entered. I clamped my hand over my nose and mouth and kept going. My eyes were soon watering as well, blurring the gross words and images spray painted on the curving walls of the underpass. This was the absolute pits, but there was a faint light ahead. Not far to go now, I thought, and I raced for the exit. I did not see him emerge from the darkness which lingered at the base of the walls, but I sure felt him. He slammed into me and sent me flying, and I ended up sprawled on the ground. I gasped. I tried to get up, but pain shot through my side where he had collided with me. I cursed at the man standing over me. He grinned back. His teeth were dark and dead stumps. The skin around his mouth was cracked and peeling away. The rest of his face was smeared in dirt and his hair was hopping with fleas. And he stank. He smelled like an open sewer in a heat wave. I would have cursed him again, but his odor was so bad that I could almost taste it. I kept my jaws clenched tightly closed. He leaned in closer and seemed to be studying me. One of his eyes bloodshot, the other was lost beneath a weeping yellow infection. And then he spoke, his voice harsh yet quiet, a distorted whisper. "You need to pay me to pass," he said. "A coin or a morsel of food will do. I'm partial to chicken slathered with a spicy sauce, but anything will do. And a drink to go with it. That would be fine indeed. A red wine, something fruity. But if you have none of those things, don't worry and don't stress. I'm in need of an eyeball as well, and yours looks shiny and clean. A good healthy eye, just one. You can keep the other. I'll just pop it out, shall I? I'll be real quick. Why, you won't even have time to blink." A long, filthy fingernail was reaching for my left eye, teasing itself into the corner of my eyeball. I felt sickened. "No way," I muttered and lashed out. He collapsed to his knees and I shot to my feet, hurdling his prone form and sprinted for the exit. His hideous toll would be going unpaid. I emerged from the underpass and got my bearings. I still had miles to go and streaks of scarlet in the sky told me that dusk was near. Time was running out for me to intercept my old supervisor and plead my case. There was a taxi rank in sight, with just one taxi waiting. Trying to keep out of sight had not worked, so I decided to go for it. I raced over to the taxi, jumped in, and gave the driver a destination. As the driver started the engine and pulled out, I heard the click of doors being locked. This was pretty standard. It prevented the passengers leaving without paying. What was far from usual was the security grills descending over the windows and the glass partition between me and the driver. They were firmly in place when the driver said, "I've been instructed to bring you in. You're clearly out of control and a Code 1 threat to the public." I slammed a fist against one of the barricaded windows. I was furious. I had walked into this jail on wheels, this trap laid by my old employers. "I'm still loyal to the Department for Strange Affairs," I told him. "I believe in order and peace." "Yeah, sure," he replied with cynicism clearing his voice. I began to shout. "You have to believe me. I used to be just like you, a monster hunter and a good one. I was dedicated. I put my neck on the line again and again." "Yeah, tell it to the bosses," he said and sped up. I could just about make out the traffic surrounding us through the narrow gaps in the grills over the windows. Progress on London's roads was often slow and frustrating, but I could see that he was turning off a main road and moving along a back street that was much quieter. I could also see these streetlights were coming on, their white glow cut into pieces by the grills. I sat back, trying to think of a way out of this. If the bosses were convinced I was a threat, they would throw me in a cell underground, most likely chained to the wall. A bowl of slop would be pushed through the slot twice a day, and once a month a bucket of freezing cold water would be thrown over me in place of a shower. I never gave much thought to the monsters that I had caught being treated this way. I figured they deserved it. Now this was my fate. The savage irony was not lost on me. The fake taxi that held me prisoner swung a left. It was fully dark outside now, and I could just about see the rundown industrial units lining the road. There was no other traffic as far as I could tell. This driver's route was off the beaten track, and the scenery left a lot to be desired, but I could only assume he knew exactly where he was going. Time was slipping away from me, and freedom would soon be a memory, and I was helpless to do anything about it. I closed my eyes. A sharp bang on the roof of the taxi snapped me out of my doleful reverie. It sounded like someone had dropped a concrete block onto the roof. Something like that. Something hard and heavy that had landed at speed. A second collision shook the vehicle. It was still moving at speed, but was veering to left and to the right now, as if the driver was trying to avoid something. What was happening? I peered out of the window and caught a glimpse of movement through the security grill. I had seen wings, long and sleek, cutting through the darkness, and suddenly I understood. We were being attacked. A third powerful impact came seconds later. The metal of the roof crumpled and the taxi skidded to a halt. I was thrown forward and face-planted into the partition. Pain spiraled out of my nose. I thought that I had broken it. I moved slowly back into my seat and was quietly groaning when a long, dark, sharp object smashed the window next to my head and then cut through the grill. I sat there holding my busted nose, warm blood dripping down my chin and licked up into the eyes of a vampire. There were points of darkness in a monstrous face that was like the shotgun wedding between a bat and a man. Its ears were flattened against the side of its head, and its nostrils flared in a wide nose. Its skin was wrinkled and scarred, and its mouth was open, revealing yellowed fangs. Its breath smelled of decay and death, of a world beyond the grave. I said with a bravado in my voice that I did not feel. "You got some serious hygiene issues, boy." The vampire snarled and reached into the back of the taxi. Hideously sharp talons protruded from where the fingers and toes would have been on the human that this creature used to be. It had used one of the talons to break into the taxi, and now it hooked one around my neck and pulled me out. I landed in a heap on the ground. Smoke was rising from the front bonnet of the taxi, and its bodywork was trashed. The driver was still in his seat, but he wasn't moving. I looked away from him. I had been angry with him for capturing me, but at the end of the day, he was only doing his job, and now he had paid the ultimate price. I peered up at the vampire and said, "You make me sick." More of the foul creatures circled the remains of the taxi, some on the ground, some in the air. I had thought being a fugitive from the department was my lowest point, but that was a walk in the park compared to this. The vampire which had broken me out of the taxi hooked its talons into my belt. Its wings flashed and I was being lifted. I was rising into the air. The buildings of London stretched out below me, the office blocks and the apartments, the churches and the shops, the new and the old intermingling and rushing past as I was carried through the sky. A derelict factory rose up before us, its smashed windows staring out over a wasteland. The vampire swooped and carried me through one of the windows. I was aware of the other creatures entering to the either side of where I was now being dangled precariously. Dozens of feet below me, the ground was layered in darkness. If it dropped me now, the last thing I saw would be that darkness rushing towards me. But the vampire was toying with me. I was helpless in its grasp, an object of scorn. It cackled and began to lower me towards the ground. As we descended, I could hear the voices of vampires all around me. There was a multitude there, many more than had attacked the taxi. Their voices were hoarse and distorted, and they joined in saying one word over and over again. "Blood, blood, blood." They were chanting this. The vampire carrying me finally dropped me a couple of feet above the ground. I fell, landing painfully, but forcing myself to sit up without delay. I had nothing left now but pride. Hope was a distant memory. There were no lights in the factory, but my eyes were beginning to adjust to the darkness. I could now make out the vampires who had been proclaiming their foul litany. They crouched shoulder to shoulder, sneering and grinning and licking their lips with disgusting, flickering tongues. I seemed to be in the center of a circle of them, and there was no possible escape through their massed ranks. But a space was opening up, because they were moving aside, for a monster from the depths of a nightmare, a walking, breathing abomination. It shared the twisted, merged features of the others, but its ears and nose were pierced, and it wore what looked chillingly like human bones as jewelry. Its skin was cut as well. Swirling symbols had been carved into it, and on its head, it wore a crown of razor wire. The barbs of the wire cut deep into its scalp. I stared transfixed as this creature approached me. It loomed over me and its mouth opened. A line of barbed razor wire was embedded in the flesh of its tongue. Fear rushed through my body, primal fear. There were things worse than death in this world, and I had always known that. And now I was looking pure evil on the face. The vampire smiled and began to speak. Its voice was the cold wind which freezes your skin. Its voice was the cold wind which howls unseen in the night and screams at terror. "Mew," it said. "Mew killed one of us, our kin. It slept in its coffin and you came and you drove a stake into its heart. Killer." The other vampires had been silent, but now they took up this last word and began to chant, "Killer, killer, killer." It was like some obscene echo. The vampire, which wore a crown of razor wire, raised a talon to quiet them, and then it continued, "And we will have our revenge. We will take it slow and savor every moment. Every second of your agony will be nectar to us. And once we have finished with you, we will deliver your body to the Department for Strange Affairs with a warning written in your last few drops of blood. The vampires will no longer skulk in the shadows. We want to rule this city, and we have come together for the first time tonight. And we shall fight as one until every last stinking human cowers before us or flees. There will be no other way." Its vile plan revealed, the vampire reared up, and then fell on me with a sickening speed. I felt its fangs cut into my flesh. Pain cascaded through my body. I felt its razor-wire tongue moving on my skin, and nausea and disgust possessed me. This was it. This was the end of me. But suddenly the vampire recoiled. It threw its head back and roared, "What is this? Your blood is tainted, poisoned. You are not a man alone. You carry the curse of the beast, the lycanthrope." It spat the blood that it had stolen from my veins onto the ground and it looked at me. Hatred burnt in its eyes. And then it said, quiet this time, in a calm, calculating voice, "There are other ways to destroy you." It raised one of its talons and moved it towards my throat. "Your werewolf blood will be spilt here and now," it whispered. I said a silent goodbye to everything and everyone I had known and cared about. I watched as the talon came closer. I watched as the world exploded into light. Clouds of light bursting all around me and high above, light cascading down. And carried in the light were voices shouting, "We have you surrounded. Surrender now or pay the price." The sudden light was making my eyes hurt. It was making the vampires curl up in agony and scream. I could make out figures descending on ropes draped from the windows, and more rushing in through a door. The building was being stormed. I recognized a couple of the faces of the people racing towards the vampires. They were former colleagues at the Department for Strange Affairs, and they and the other men and women flooding the factory were brandishing crossbows loaded with wooden stakes. If any of the vampires stepped out of line, they would be swiftly and terminally dealt with. One man among the department's forces was unharmed. He moved through the crowded space looking calm and suave. He wore a three-piece pinstripe suit and tan-colored brogues. His gait showed that he had a prosthetic leg. It was my old supervisor, the man that I had been trying to reach. He walked up to me, smoothly sidestepping vampires that were being dragged out of the way, and asked, "How are you?" "Still breathing," I replied, and mighty confused. "I owe you an explanation and an apology," he said. "We had been hearing rumors that the vampires were planning a mass uprising, that the loners in the various gangs were being drawn into a plot led by a particularly nasty individual. We knew the best way to foil them was catch them when they were all gathered in one place. And to do this, we needed something to lure them." I scowled, beginning to understand what the department had done. "You used me as bait," I growled. He nodded. "And for that, I apologize. We knew the vampires had a reason to hate you after you had killed one of their own. And with you an outcast from the department, they would see you as an easier target. It didn't all go to plan, and I'll always regret the loss of our driver. But we got there in the end. The vampire threat is neutralized for now." He turned away and surveyed the scene of organized chaos unfolding around us. The vampires were being forced into cages. The ringleader was in chains and being led to his own personal steel prison. Then my old supervisor looked back at me and said, "Which leaves me with a question. When can you start work? The department wants you back, and I want you back. We will find a way to deal with your lycanthropy, which doesn't interfere with your role as a monster hunter." I didn't even need to think about my answer. "Forget it," I yelled. "I trusted you, I respected you, and you used me." And then I walked away. Alone and pulsing with anger, I walked out into the night. The darkness promised mystery and danger, and I was not afraid.